At my brother's promotion party, I was just the nobody younger sibling until his commanding officer spotted me across the room, snapped to attention, and saluted, "Commander Dawson." In that one moment, everything shifted. You think your family knows you. Think again. This is the story of how I went from invisible to irreplaceable and why I never needed their praise to prove my worth. Caleb Dawson had always known silence. Not the kind that came with peace, but the kind that wrapped itself around you like heavy and suffocating. At 35, he was a civil engineer who worked with soil and steel, designing infrastructure most people would never notice beneath their feet. He liked it that way, quiet, methodical, unseen. Because being seen in his family had never worked out well for him. He was the younger son in a family carved from uniformed pride. His father, Richard Dawson, was a retired Navy lieutenant colonel. The type of man who still pressed his shirts with military precision and kept his shoes inspection ready. Richard lived by rank order and legacy. His oldest son, Ethan, had followed that legacy like a blueprint decorated Marine bronze stars overseas deployments. He was everything Richard believed a Dawson should be: fearless, disciplined, proud. And then there was Caleb. He had been different from the start, quieter, more observant. Where Ethan barked commands during childhood games of war, Caleb sat under the porch, dismantling radios and sketching bridges. He never raised his voice, never fought for the spotlight. Not because he lacked the fire, he just didn't see the point in shouting into a wind that never turned his way. At family dinners, Richard would ask Ethan about combat drills or deployment rumors while Caleb sat with a fork frozen midair, his latest achievement dying on his tongue. One Thanksgiving, after Caleb had won a grant for a project designing sustainable water systems, he brought the letter to the table. His mother Ellen smiled and said, "That's lovely, honey." But before she could read it, Richard had already turned to Ethan. "So what's this I hear about new joint training ops in the Pacific?" It wasn't outright cruelty, it was worse. It was dismissal. "Your brother was commanding platoons at your age," Richard once told him when Caleb tried to show him an early college project. "Maybe one day you'll find what you're good at." It was the kind of remark that nestled itself in the bones, growing heavier with each repetition. Caleb didn't answer. He rarely did. Not because he didn't have words, but because he had long since learned they didn't land. Not with them. Ethan wore his superiority like a second skin. His jokes were backhanded compliments. "Hey, little bro," he'd call from across the room during barbecues. "You build anything useful lately, or are you still playing with Legos?" The others would laugh. Even Ellen would give a nervous chuckle, never quite knowing how to deflect. At 35, Caleb still felt like the 16-year-old who couldn't catch his father's eye. He still remembered the state science fair where he'd presented a climate-resilient shelter design. He had won first place. On the drive home, Richard barely said a word except, "Did you remember to thank the judges properly?" Every corner of the Dawson household was lined with Ethan's victories, framed medals, commendations, newspaper clippings. Caleb had a small corner in the den next to the bookshelf with a dusty photo from a high school robotics competition. No one ever dusted it, yet Caleb never rebelled. He didn't drink. He didn't fight back. He worked hard quietly, as if trying to build enough worth with blueprints and stress tests. He made himself invisible to avoid being measured again and found lacking. He'd moved out at 22 and never truly moved back. Not emotionally. He called his mother once a month. Richard barely came to the phone. Ethan occasionally sent mass family texts with pictures of new deployments, promotions, girlfriends. Caleb responded with a thumbs-up emoji, if anything. In a family obsessed with image and rank, Caleb had become the blank space, the one who didn't quite fit. And they let him know it. "You'll never be like your brother. his father had once said flatly after Caleb politely declined an invitation to join the Navy. Some men aren't built for command. What Richard never understood was that Caleb never wanted to command the way Ethan did. He didn't crave applause or medals. He craved precision, clarity, and purpose. That didn't make him weak. But to Richard, anything not wrapped in camo or marching orders was civilian softness. Even Ellen, with her softer voice and warm eyes, struggled to see him clearly. She tried in her way, sending birthday cards with handwritten notes asking about his work, but she rarely dug deeper. Maybe she didn't know how. Maybe she was afraid of what she'd find if she did. So Caleb built his life far from their expectations. He constructed bridges and storm tunnels, reinforced dams and earthquake supports. He worked with engineers who respected his calculations, not his last name. He earned quiet recognition in journals and municipal contracts. But in the Dawson family, none of that made him a hero. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but there was a dull ache, a persistent sense of being misunderstood, undervalued. And the worst part, sometimes he believed them. Sometimes he looked in the mirror and saw not the quiet, capable man he had become, but the forgotten second son. The disappointment, the shadow. But in those moments he would think of the one person who had once seen him differently. His late grandfather, also a Navy man, but a gentler one. Before he passed, the old man had pulled Caleb aside and said, "You've got your own kind of strength, kid. You don't need to shout to move mountains." Caleb had never forgotten that. Still, it was hard to hold on to when you spent decades being overlooked. Every family gathering reinforced the same message: Ethan was the blueprint. Caleb was the draft that didn't make the cut. Until one day something shifted. Not in them, in him. It wasn't revenge he wanted, it was something deeper, a reckoning. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove to himself that they had never really seen him at all. And that was their failure, not his. He didn't need their permission to matter. But he wasn't done with them yet, and fate, always silent, always watching, had a way of forcing reckonings at just the right time. Caleb had never needed loud words to feel deeply. He had grown up absorbing the smallest shifts in tone, the glances that lingered a second too long, the way silence could stretch between people. Like glass, clear, thin, and ready to shatter. If there was anyone in his family he ever truly felt connected to, it was his mother. Ellen Dawson had always been gentle in a house full of discipline. She had warm hands and soft eyes and a voice that rarely rose above a hush. When he was young, Caleb had often crawled into her lap during thunderstorms, curling into her arms while the sky roared outside. She would stroke his hair and whisper stories about faraway place. For a while it was enough, but as he grew older, something subtle shifted. Ellen's kindness never disappeared, but her voice began to falter, not in tone but in courage. Richard's presence was like a fixed anchor, immovable, impossible to question. And Ethan, as the favored son, seemed to carry that same gravitational pull. Ellen became quieter around them, more hesitant. She never outright agreed with Richard's dismissals of Caleb's interests, but she didn't challenge them either. Not when he belittled Caleb's engineering aspirations. Not when Ethan made his jokes. It was a silence Caleb learned to recognize, not malicious but complicit. Protective perhaps, but not protective enough of him. She'd offer small kindnesses in private, saving him the last slice of pie, slipping a handwritten card into his suitcase when he left after visits. Once she gave him a silver compass for his 28th birthday with a simple note: "Find your own way, Caleb. I believe in you." He never asked her what she meant. He just carried it like everything else. But it was Ethan who turned familial judgment into a sharpened tool. To Ethan, Caleb wasn't just different, he was beneath him. The word nobody became a nickname flung with a casual cruelty only brothers could master. Hey, nobody, what are you building these days? More pipe dreams, he'd ask in front of guests, his smirk wide and cruel. When Ethan started dating women in uniform Air Force Navy, even a West Point cadet, he seemed to take special pleasure in parading them in front of Caleb. At family gatherings, he'd make sure to introduce them with an exaggerated flair. This is Lieutenant Stephanie. She saved more lives than Caleb's water pipes ever will. The worst part, no one stopped him. Ellen would give Caleb a sympathetic glance but never speak up. Richard laughed along. The women usually just looked confused. Caleb didn't respond, not because he didn't have a retort, but because none of them would have heard it anyway. The insults weren't just verbal. They were structural, coded into the way his achievements were weighed. His promotions in engineering meant little next to Ethan's combat reports. His innovations in flood prevention were considered nice, while Ethan's tactical field deployments were celebrated like acts of divine service. But Caleb had grown used to being underestimated. What he never got used to was the ache of being unseen. That ache had roots older than he could fully remember. There was a scar that ran across the side of his ribs, thin but deep like a lightning bolt etched in flesh. It was the result of an accident when he was 10. He had fallen, or so the official story went, down the steep ravine behind their old house. The details were always murky. He remembered trees rushing water, a sharp crack against his side, and then darkness. Ethan had been with him that day, but refused to say what had happened. Richard chalked it up to childhood recklessness. Ellen cried but didn't press. Caleb didn't speak of it after. The injury left him in the hospital for nearly a month. The pain faded, but something else remained, a quiet fear, a cautious step, a subtle turn inward. From that point on, he stopped climbing trees, stopped riding bikes, stopped speaking up in class. He grew smaller in a world that only respected those who took up space. In that silence, Caleb began to feel things more intensely than anyone knew. He read people's faces like blueprints. He learned to predict arguments by the way Richard set his jaw or Ethan tapped his foot. He built emotional walls early, not out of resentment, but out of survival. By the time he reached his 20s, he had mastered the art of being physically present but emotionally cloaked. Friends saw him as reserved but kind. Colleagues admired his focus but found him difficult to read. Women he dated described him as thoughtful but distant. No one ever quite got past the surface, and Caleb preferred it that way. Letting people in meant handing them the tools to hurt him, and he had already been wounded in ways most people couldn't see. His mother once said, "You've always felt things too deeply, Caleb." She meant it as a compliment, but he heard it as a diagnosis. Still, he loved her in the quiet way he knew how. He'd send her articles he thought she'd enjoy. He'd check on her after storms. He made sure her gutters were clean every fall. But he never told her how much it hurt that she hadn't defended him more, that her silence had carved just as deep as his father's words. He kept the compass she gave him in his top drawer. On especially hard days, he'd hold it, trying to believe that her notes still meant something, that she really did believe in him. But the doubts were louder, especially when Ethan was around. The last time they were in the same room before the party, Ethan had walked past him at a family barbecue and clapped him on the back. Still keeping the world safe from leaky faucets, nobody, Caleb didn't flinch. He just nodded as always and turned back to the grill. Later that night, he'd sat on the porch alone, staring out at the yard, wondering how long a man could be ignored before he stopped believing he was worth noticing. It wasn't self-pity, it was erosion. But something in him was changing, slowly, a quiet burn beneath the surface. He didn't want revenge. He didn't need their approval. But he needed to know he deserved to be seen, truly seen. And when that moment finally came, it would not be with shouting. It would be with quiet certainty, the kind that didn't ask for permission to exist. No goodbye letter, no ceremony, no announcement over a family dinner. Caleb Dawson left home the way he had lived in it, quietly, without fanfare, slipping through the cracks of his family's attention. At 27, he packed 2 bags, left his engineering job with no explanation, and boarded a bus headed west. He didn't even use his full name when he enlisted. On paper, he became Caleb Thomas, choosing his middle name as his last to avoid the weight that Dawson carried. No one knew. Not Ethan, who was stationed overseas and probably wouldn't have cared. Not Richard, who hadn't asked Caleb about his life in over a year. Not even Ellen, who might have cried but wouldn't have stopped him. Caleb left because staying meant shrinking even further, and there was nothing left of him to shrink. What drove him wasn't anger, though it hummed quietly under the surface. It was purpose. He had built bridges, reinforced cities, stabilized mountainsides, but he had never built himself. And deep down beneath the logic and restraint, there was a fire. He was done waiting for someone to see it. He would become undeniable. Boot camp was the first real test. It was a culture shock, a world of barking orders, punishing drills, and stripped identity. Most recruits arrived cocky, eager to prove their toughness. Caleb arrived invisible, but invisibility became his edge. He listened more than he spoke, observed before acting, and when it came time to perform push-ups, marksmanship, underwater training, he did it all with a quiet efficiency that unnerved the instructors. They started calling him Ghost. "Ghost doesn't talk much," one sergeant muttered, "but he doesn't miss either." It was during this time that his leadership started to show, not through dominance but precision. In team exercises, he could see 3 moves ahead. He rerouted their formations before anyone else sensed danger. He steadied panicking teammates without shouting. When a drill sergeant asked who would volunteer to carry an injured squad mate through the mud, Caleb stepped forward without hesitation and finished first. Still, he stayed under the radar. He had no interest in medals or praise. He just wanted to grow stronger, sharper, more capable. Every drop of sweat, every blister, every cold night on the ground was a way of chiseling himself into someone new. When he was quietly recommended for Bud's basic underwater demolition SEAL training, he accepted without hesitation. He didn't tell anyone back home. They still thought he was in engineering. Ellen had texted him a recipe for his birthday. Ethan hadn't messaged in months. Richard didn't even know where he lived. That detachment became armor. Bud's was brutal beyond measure. The training broke most people physically, mentally, spiritually. Hell Week was infamous, 5 days with barely any sleep, endless fizz. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the strongest, but he had a kind of quiet resilience that couldn't be taught. During underwater drills, when recruits panicked, Caleb stayed calm. When exhaustion blurred everyone's judgment, he adapted. When his own body screamed at him to quit, he remembered the silence of his father, the laughter of Ethan, the look in Ellen's eyes when she didn't speak up. And he kept going. He was one of the few who made it to the end. When they handed him the trident symbol of the SEALs, no one was there to witness it. No cheering family, no photos, just him, the wind, and a silent pride he buried deep. He didn't cry, he didn't call home, he just breathed like he was doing it for the first time. From there he moved into active missions, counterterrorism, hostage rescue, surveillance. He quickly earned the respect of his team. Not because he barked orders or demanded loyalty, but because he listened, led from the middle, took the hardest assignments without complaint. In chaotic missions, he saw structure. In failure, he saw recalibration. The name Ghost stuck, but now it came with respect. He started building a reputation in the shadows of the military world. His name circulated in closed briefings. A strategist in the field, a ghost with a conscience. His commanders called him a stabilizer. His teammates called him a lifeline. And yet the silence from home persisted. He'd sometimes scroll through Ethan's social media photos in uniform smiles with generals' speeches at Veterans Day events. Richard commented often, praising every medal. Ellen clicked hearts on every post. Caleb's inbox remained empty. He didn't mind, or told himself he didn't. But on quiet nights after a mission when the adrenaline had faded and the wounds were wrapped, he would hold that old compass from his mother. "Find your own way," it said. He had, but he still wondered if she ever meant to send him so far from her. One night, a teammate asked him, "Why'd you join Ghost?" Caleb had paused, then answered truthfully, "Because they didn't think I could." And that was it. No vendetta, no glory, just the simple truth. They pushed him out, so he built himself in silence. The worst kind of silence is the one that follows a scream. Caleb remembered the explosion first, a split-second roar that tore through the desert air like it was shredding the very atmosphere. Then came the stillness, dust, debris, static in his earpiece, the absence of a voice he should have heard, then two, then three. The mission was a hostage rescue operation in northern Syria, classified high stakes and chaotic from the start. The intel had been vague, the terrain unforgiving. They had gone in under night cover under Caleb's command with 12 on the team and 2 hostages to extract. They left with 9. 3 of his men boys he'd trained with bled with saved lives with never made it out. Staff Sergeant Donovan, Lieutenant Patel, Corporal Reyes. Each one had stood beside him in darker missions. Each one had called him Ghost with a kind of reverence. Each one had trusted him to lead, and he had. But that night something went wrong. An IED that hadn't been flagged. A secondary ambush no drone had caught. Within seconds, half his squad was in chaos, and by the time they secured the hostages and pulled back, the damage was irreversible. The guilt wasn't immediate. The mission had succeeded technically. The hostages were safe. The objective was met. Command called it a necessary cost, but Caleb didn't think in numbers. He thought in names, faces. Laughter shared during night watches, late-night talks under canvas tents, Reyes's off-key singing, Patel's obsession with chess, Donovan's stories about his kid. He carried them with him. And when Command offered him the Distinguished Service Cross, he declined. It wasn't about humility. It was about grief. He didn't want to see his name on a stage, didn't want applause, didn't want to watch parents receive folded flags while the world smiled at him for doing his job. Why turn it down? A superior had asked him, not unkindly. Caleb's answer was simple. Because some scars aren't meant for display. He returned from that mission quieter than ever. His team noticed. Sarah, one of the few who'd known him since the early days, pulled him aside. "You can't carry all of it," she said. "I'm not," he replied, "just the part that matters." But the truth was heavier. The burden of survival guilt crept in slowly. He began to have trouble sleeping. The desert sounds haunted him, wind rustling through sand. Distant echoes of gunfire, the static silence where a voice should have been. For the first time in years, he considered leaving the SEALs. Not because he wasn't capable, but because he had nothing left to prove and something inside him had begun to fracture. He needed time, space, air. So he made the hardest call of all. He requested reassignment. The paperwork went through quietly, as most things in Caleb's life did. No ceremony, no farewell party. Just a debrief, a firm handshake from Commander Foster, and an envelope with words he hadn't expected. Inside was a single line. "You didn't fail them. You brought the rest of us home." He kept that note with the compass from his mother. A month later, Caleb Thomas resurfaced, this time under the radar in a civilian engineering firm in Northern Virginia. To anyone who asked, he'd spent the last few years doing contract work overseas. Infrastructure, he'd say. Water systems, mostly. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. He took a job designing structural reinforcements for metro tunnels, quiet work, exacting work. Work that didn't involve bullets or encrypted briefings or last-minute airlifts. His co-workers liked him well enough. Reserved, sharp, precise. He didn't go out for beers, didn't show up on social media. No one asked too many questions. That was how he preferred it. But the ghosts came with him. He'd sometimes catch himself staring out the office window, eyes unfocused, replaying the ambush frame by frame. Other days, he'd be fine, locked into schematics and soil analysis, and then something would knock the wind out of him, a scent, a sound, a word. He didn't talk about the war, didn't mention the trident tucked in a drawer beneath his blueprints, didn't speak of Reyes, Patel, or Donovan. That grief, he'd decided, was sacred. He visited their names once etched into a marble wall at a memorial service he didn't attend officially. Just stood at a distance, cap low, breathing through his nose, reading their names in silence. A mother passed him crying. He lowered his gaze and stepped back. No one recognized him. That was how he preferred it. Because silence wasn't weakness, it was reverence. It was how he remembered them, not as headlines or posthumous medals, but as brothers who deserved more than a footnote. Sometimes at night he'd unfold that letter from Foster, or hold his mother's compass. The past wasn't gone. It was tucked neatly beneath the surface like the steel supports he now designed, invisible but essential. And though he never said it aloud, he had made a quiet vow. He would not wear their deaths like a badge. He would carry them as ballast weight that kept him steady, grounded, real. In the silence, he honored them. The invitation came through email tucked between a car insurance reminder and a store coupon. It was from Ellen Short, polite, emotionally neutral. Subject: Ethan's promotion party. Hi Caleb, your brother's being promoted to major next month. We're hosting a small gathering at the Officers Club in Annapolis. I thought you might want to come. It starts at 1800. No pressure. Mom. There was no RSVP deadline. No follow-up call. Just a suggestion, more obligation than inclusion. Caleb stared at the message for a long while, the cursor blinking beneath it like a challenge. He hadn't spoken to Ethan in over 2 years, hadn't seen his father since before the reassignment, and hadn't been to a family gathering since. What, their mother's birthday 4 years ago? Still something pulled at him. It wasn't pride, and it sure as hell wasn't curiosity about Ethan's promotion. It was something else, something like a thread of loyalty that refused to snap no matter how much silence had frayed it. He clicked reply. I'll be there. The Officers Club was all shining brass and polished floors, the kind of place where honor was worn like a second skin. Everyone there spoke in measured tones, using full names, firm handshakes, and eyes that scanned for rank. Caleb arrived just past 1800 in a plain navy suit, no tie. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes caught everything. The placements, the exits, the rhythm of conversation, the carefully spaced laughter. Old instincts. The room was full of navy whites and marine blues scattered among civilians in pressed shirts and proud expressions. Near the bar, Richard stood, whiskey in hand, booming laughter echoing off the walls. Ellen was chatting sickly with a couple near the buffet. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. No one noticed Caleb arrive. That was fine. He hovered at the edge of the room, sipping club soda, scanning the faces. The photo montage behind the podium showed Ethan at every stage of military glory, boot camp, officer school deployments. Not a single one of Caleb, not even from childhood. He turned toward the door when he heard a name called out with delight. Lieutenant Bella Monroe. The voice belonged to Richard, his expression lighting up as he crossed the room to greet a woman in dress uniform, crisp, confident, composed. Caleb paused. Bella. That name rang with familiarity more than a passing acquaintance. Then it clicked. Not from family or photos, from after-action reports, classified briefings. She was one of the youngest SEAL officers to lead her own fire team, a rising star with 4 confirmed successful missions. Smart, sharp, respected. She moved through the room with ease, shaking hands, smiling. And then she saw him. Her eyes widened just a hair. Then she adjusted her expression, gliding toward him with practiced calm. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said, voice low. Caleb smiled faintly. "Didn't expect to be here. You're not on the guest list, I'm family." She tilted her head, processing that, then nodded. "Ah, the brother." He gave a small nod. "You know Eth." She hesitated, then looked around. "We're seeing each other." Caleb didn't react, just sipped his drink. "Does he know who you work with?" "No," she said. "I figured it wasn't relevant. Besides, you're a ghost. Half the teams think you don't exist." Caleb let a small smirk tug at his lips. "Works in my favor." A pause. "I'm glad you're here," she said after a beat. "He might not be, but I am." She moved on before anyone could notice them speaking for too long. The rest of the evening blurred. Ethan arrived to fanfare, decorated, handsome, loud. He worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, clapping backs, telling jokes. When he spotted Caleb, his expression didn't change. No warmth, no hostility, just recognition, like he was seeing a former classmate he didn't particularly miss. "You made it," he said, voice measured. "Got the email," Caleb replied. Ethan looked him up and down. "Didn't expect you'd come." "I didn't either." A long pause stretched between them. Then Ethan offered a stiff nod and walked away. No hug, no welcome, just dismissal in its purest form. Caleb returned to the shadows of the room, watching from afar. He wasn't surprised, but a part of him, the part that still remembered bunk beds and Lego sets, ached anyway. During dinner, he sat alone at a corner table, chewing slowly, pretending not to notice the looks. Richard gave a toast halfway through, all bluster and glory. He called Ethan a true son of the Navy, his voice trembling with pride. Caleb looked down at his plate, a quiet stone settling in his chest. Later, during mingling, a captain asked Caleb what he did. "Civil engineering," he answered. "Ah," the captain said, losing interest. "Good, honest work." Caleb nodded and said nothing more. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here because despite everything, they were still his family. And when the invitation came, half-hearted though it was, he chose to show up. Not to prove anything, not to be recognized, but because the part of him that still believed in connection hadn't died on a battlefield or in a training pit. Not yet. As the party wore on, Bella passed him again. She didn't stop, just squeezed his shoulder lightly in passing. It was the only genuine touch of the night. And for Caleb, it was enough for now. It started with a look. Bella was returning from the bar, 2 drinks in hand, weaving through officers and their dates, her dress whites catching the soft golden light of the officers' club chandeliers. Her face was composed as always, military-trained stillness over a curious mind. But as she passed Caleb again, something shifted. She slowed. A flicker, a blink. Her body paused, eyes narrowing, the weight of recognition crashing through practiced decorum. She had seen those eyes before. Not here, not in this crowd of polished egos and medals gleaming like awards on display. She had seen them in a briefing room in Bagram 2 years prior. She'd been a junior lieutenant then, shadowing high-ranking SEAL operations in classified theater. One mission stood out, codenamed Operation Winterfold, a near-suicide run into hostile territory to extract embedded assets. The unit had been elite. The leader had been only referred to in briefings as Commander Dawson, a name whispered with reverence. That same commander had stood in front of them, backlit by desert sun scar just beneath his ear. Voice low but firm. He had outlined the mission not with bravado, but with clarity, steady, surgical, and unwavering. It had stuck with her. And now that same man, same voice, same eyes was sitting at the edge of a party as if he didn't belong. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the drinks down on a nearby table without a word. Then she turned, straightened, walked toward him. The room didn't notice yet. "Sir," she said quietly, stopping just in front of him. Caleb looked up. His gaze was calm, measured, but something in it flickered when he saw her face. "I wasn't sure," she whispered. "I didn't know until just now." She drew in a breath. Then in one crisp motion, heels together, back straight, she snapped into attention. Her voice rang through the room, "Commander Dawson." "It's an honor, sir." Silence fell like a dropped rifle. The clinking of forks ceased. Conversations cut mid-laugh. Chairs creaked as heads turned. 100 eyes swung toward them in perfect synchronization, expressions shifting from idle interest to stunned confusion. At the center, Bella remained frozen in salute, formal, precise, and unmistakably sincere. Caleb's posture didn't change, but his eyes flicked around the room, measuring the fallout. Then he slowly stood, responding with a salute of his own, sharp and clean. "At ease, Lieutenant," he said, voice calm. Bella lowered her hand, but not her gaze. "I trained under you during Winterfold," she said quietly. "I didn't recognize you until just now." "You led us through fire." Gasps stirred in the crowd. From across the room, Ethan's expression contorted. He stood frozen, his hand halfway to a glass of champagne. "What the hell?" he muttered. Richard stepped forward, mouth agape. Commander Caleb didn't flinch. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't wanted this, but the truth had stepped into the spotlight without permission. Bella took a half step back, suddenly aware of the attention but unashamed. "Sorry, sir," she said quietly, "but I think people deserve to know." Ethan crossed the room, voice sharp with disbelief. "You're kidding me," he barked. "Caleb, commander of what civilian tunnels?" Bella turned to him, frowning. "You didn't know." Ethan looked from her to Caleb, eyes narrowing. "You let us all believe you were, what, a damn maintenance worker?" Caleb tilted his head slightly, voice steady. "I let you believe what you wanted to believe." The crowd buzzed louder. Someone from the back asked, "Is this real, Dawson?" Another whispered, "I thought he worked for the county." Richard's voice boomed above the murmurs. "Caleb, what the hell is going on?" Caleb exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to walk out. "I served," he said simply, "for the past 12 years, in classified operations. The specifics were never meant to be public." "Classified," Ethan snapped. "Or fake?" Bella stepped forward. "He's telling the truth." She turned to the crowd now, no hesitation. "I've served under this man. His mission saved lives that would have been lost under any other commander. You're celebrating a promotion. He survived operations that would leave most of us broken. He trained teams that now lead the front lines." Caleb's jaw tensed. He didn't want this attention, didn't need it, but it was too late. The silence had cracked. Ellen stood now, her hands shaking slightly. "You were in combat?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "Yes, Mom." Richard's voice turned quieter. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" "You never asked," Caleb said. "And I couldn't answer even if you had." Ethan's face twisted. "You let me call you a nobody." Caleb met his eyes. "I was never a nobody, Ethan. You just never saw me." The truth hung there, heavy, irrevocable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone started to clap, softly, unsure. Then another joined. Within seconds, the room echoed with applause, not the polite kind, but the raw, hesitant. The sound of people reconciling two versions of someone they thought they knew. Caleb stood still, his expression unreadable. Bella didn't clap. She just looked at him and nodded once. Respect, recognition, Not for the uniform, not for the medals, but for the silence he had carried with grace. The applause didn't last long. Like waves hitting a seawall, the claps broke apart, faded, and left only the silence behind. Thicker now, pregnant with reevaluation. Ethan stood rooted, his mouth slightly open, eyes locked on Caleb. A cocktail of confusion, betrayal, and disbelief warred across his features. He started, then stopped. His voice was cracked as if unused to expressing anything other than control. He tried again. You were a SEAL. All this time Caleb didn't move. Yes, and you never said anything. You let us think you were just some washed-out engineer. Caleb's jaw flexed. You never asked. Ethan recoiled slightly as though the words carried an edge. You let me mock you. You chose to mock me, Caleb replied quietly. You needed me to be small so you could stay big. That struck harder than expected. Ethan's eyes flicked away, searching the floor for refuge. His breath caught in his throat. You were the commander in that Syria op, he finally asked, voice lower now. The one they said. Saved Bravo unit. Caleb nodded once. You were there. I was the one who called the route shift. We extracted under fire 2 hours before air support could arrive. Ethan's mouth opened again, then closed. He backed away a step, the truth crashing down on him like a load he could no longer lift. He looked around at the faces that had always belonged to his world, his friends, his mentors, his father, and saw all of them turning now toward Caleb. That was the moment it broke, not Caleb's silence. Ethan's certainty. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, he just sat down right there at the side of the ballroom, his hands gripping his knees, eyes blank, breath shallow. It was the closest he'd ever come to collapse. Ellen watched him, then slowly turned to Caleb. Her voice, when it came, was trembling. Why didn't you ever tell us? Caleb met her eyes. Because I wasn't allowed to. Because I didn't need to. Because I knew it wouldn't matter. She flinched. I was proud of you, she whispered. No, Caleb said, not unkindly. You were proud of Ethan, and I didn't blame you. I just learned to live around it. Richard stepped forward next. For once, the medals on his chest looked heavy instead of proud. You lied, he said, not angry, just bewildered. I obeyed orders, Caleb replied. And I protected my team. That was my job. And now Caleb said, I'm just trying to eat dinner. The air shifted. Laughter would have felt wrong, but the tension eased like a splinter finally pulled from flesh. Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes, for the first time in Caleb's life, softened, not with disappointment, but something closer to curiosity. You were good, he said finally. Really good. Caleb didn't respond. Ellen reached for his hand. I missed you every day, she said, and now I realize I didn't know you at all. You didn't need to, Caleb said gently. I was never doing it to be seen. There was silence again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was respectful. Ethan still hadn't spoken. He just sat there unmoving, staring at the floor like it might offer answers. Bella finally stepped over and crouched next to him. Your brother saved me once, she said softly, and probably a lot more people than that. He looked at her, eyes shining. I didn't know, he croaked. I thought I was the hero. She gave him a sad smile. You are, but so is he. Just a different kind. He nodded once, small, broken, and for the first time in years really saw his brother. Caleb didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply walked over, placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder, and said the words that ended it all. I never needed your respect, but I'm glad I earned it. Later that night, after the guests had left and the lights in the living room had dimmed, Caleb sat on the back porch. The hum of crickets filled the air, but his thoughts were loud. He didn't hear the sliding door open behind him until his mother Ellen appeared quietly, 2 mugs of chamomile tea in her hands. "I didn't know if you'd want to talk," she said softly, offering him one. Caleb accepted it with a small nod. "Thanks." They sat in silence for a moment. Then, without looking at him, she spoke again. "I failed you, Caleb. You didn't." "I did," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I stood by and let your father put all his pride in Ethan. I told myself I was protecting peace in the family, but all I did was leave you alone in it." He sipped the tea. It was warm, familiar. "I didn't need much," he said, "just to be seen." Ellen turned to face him fully now, her eyes red. "I found something earlier before the party, in the attic. Letters, addressed to me, from Afghanistan. Syria. The return address was just initials. I never opened them. I thought they were reports from the base, but they were from you, weren't they?" Caleb nodded. "I didn't sign my full name. I didn't want to break protocol, but I wanted you to know I was alive. I thought maybe one day you'd read them." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I should have known. I should have opened them." He looked at her gently. "I knew you loved me, even if you didn't know how to fight for me." She reached out, took his hand in both of hers, trembling. "Can I read them now?" Caleb gave a faint smile. "Yeah, I'd like that." And in that quiet under the stars, for the first time in decades, Ellen saw her son, not the silent shadow of his brother. Not the disappointment she once feared, but Caleb. The man who had never asked to be celebrated. Just understood. The next morning the house was still. Caleb had risen early as always, the way years of deployment had trained him. He sat at the dining table reading the paper, more out of habit than interest, when footsteps approached. It was his father, Richard Dawson, freshly shaven, still in his robe. He paused at the doorway, unusually hesitant. "You have a moment?" he asked. Caleb nodded. Richard sat down across from him, folding his hands like a man about to deliver news he'd rehearsed 100 times. "For years," Richard began slowly, "I measured men by medals, by rank, by the way they filled out a uniform." He looked at Caleb, eyes sharp but softer than before. "I forgot there's another kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be real." Caleb said nothing, letting the silence stretch. "I was wrong," Richard said. "I judged you by the wrong standards, expected you to be Ethan. But you became something more." Then, after a deep breath, he added, "Commander Dawson." Caleb blinked. Of all the times he'd heard that title, none had felt quite like this. "Say that again," he asked, unsure if he imagined it. Richard's lips twitched with something like pride. "You heard me." "Commander, I should have called you that a long time ago." Caleb's throat tightened. "I never needed you to salute me, Dad." Richard nodded. "I know, but maybe I needed to." They sat in silence, the morning sun cutting through the kitchen window. For the first time there were no lectures, no comparisons, no Ethan between them. Just two men finally seeing eye to eye. "You raised a soldier," Caleb said quietly. "Just not the one you expected." Richard reached over, patted his hand. "No," he said, "I raised a man, and that's more than I could have asked for." And in that moment, the only salute that mattered was the one given without lifting a hand. Just a look, a truth, and finally, a father's pride. Weeks after the reunion, Caleb returned to base, not for a mission, but for something more personal. The commanding officer had reached out with a quiet request: would Caleb consider mentoring a new class of SEAL candidates, not as a trainer, as a soul who'd been through it all. He didn't hesitate. But he insisted on one thing: anonymity. In the makeshift room off the training grounds, he spoke to them not in uniform, not with rank. Just a quiet man in a plain jacket, his face mostly turned from the light. They didn't know his name, but they listened. He spoke of fear, of silence, of surviving hell, not just on missions, but at home, where doubt and dismissal were often worse than bullets. He didn't need to say he was a SEAL. The weight in his voice said enough. Later, he was invited by a fellow veteran to speak on a podcast series called Unseen Valor. It was raw, real, and anonymous. Perfect. Caleb hesitated at first, but that night, staring at his unopened medals tucked away in a drawer, he realized he had never told his story for applause. He told it for those still unseen. The episode aired under the title The Quiet Commander. He spoke of growing up in shadows, of being dismissed by family, of nearly drowning in self-doubt, and of rising anyway. He never named names. But his voice cracked when he said sometimes silence is the loudest battlefield. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of listeners, then millions. Emails poured in from soldiers, nurses, teachers, even teenagers. People who'd been silenced, overlooked, unseen. One message read, "I thought I was nothing too until I heard you. Thank you for surviving." Caleb didn't reply. He didn't need to, because finally in the dark his story was shining, and not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever been told they were nobody.